Afternoon, everybody. Come on, it's after lunch. Thank you for coming. I see we still got a couple of stragglers in the room. I thought I'd start with what are you going to get at this talk? So I won't be offended if you leave after this slide, right? For those of you who know me, I've presented at the event a couple of times. I have the honor of doing the keynote once. I've always kind of taken the technology route at DevConf, right? It's my passion. It's kind of still what I do on a day-to-day basis. We'll talk a little bit about that now in the talk. But today's a little bit different. Today I want to kind of share some of my career journey with you, some of the decisions I made, and a lot of the discussions I've had over the last couple of years is how did you end up as a CTO and what career path did you take? And there's a lot of lessons in that I thought I would share because I think there's some important decisions to make along your career path and your journey, and also important things to recognize what you gain and also, very importantly, what you give up, what lots of people don't talk about. So that's what I'm going to try and cover today. A little bit of who am I? I studied electrical engineering. This reprobate from BBD in the front here was in my class when I studied electrical engineering. Then I got into process control, spent a bunch of time running around factories, automating electronics. Then I did a little stint in military electronics where we literally did electronic design. At that point, I already decided that I didn't like building circuit boards on a day-to-day basis and that I was really drawn into software. And I had a really fortunate turn of events where I joined a team in Nedbank as they were building the second internet banking site in the world. And I kind of lived the journey of building internet banking, and we were unfortunately second to launch, as I said, in the world. But it was fascinating joining a team in a bank that delivered a very, at that stage, kind of market-moving product. We sort of had a competition with the physical branch guys at the time, and I think in 6 months' time, we were the biggest branch in the bank, and in other words, we had more users than any of their branches. And I fondly remember, not really, the CIO of Nedbank at the time, Barry Hall, walking into my office, because I'd crashed the internet banking server for the 5th time that day, and basically telling me, I'm either going to fix this now, or I'm going to be out on the street getting a new job, right? There's nothing like pressure like that to make sure you write good code. Then I joined Microsoft, and I spent 17 years at Microsoft, and I had lots of different roles at Microsoft, kind of all the way through consulting, and eventually I was a director of the local business, running one of the divisions, and it kind of always called this my MBA. This was my MBA on how large enterprises work. And then I did something completely different. I joined a startup as I exited Microsoft, so I went from a company of north of 200,000 people to a company of 3. And it's amazing how you learn to do everything when you're in a company of 3 versus in a company of 200,000, right? I called myself the CTO, as you can see there, but I was also head of IT. I also washed dishes. I set up LAN points. I put up APs. So a very different experience, quite humbling, actually. Then I did a little stint in consulting, and now I'm in my current role as the CTO of Netstar, part of the Altron Group, a listed JSE entity. We have about 1,500 people that work for us. We're about a 2 billion rand company. So I kind of think of this as my teenager, right? I work for the big one, I work for the little one, and now I'm kind of in the teenager phase. And it's kind of interesting to get the experience of multiple different companies. I'm going to try and share some of that with you today. So I think many people think of the CTO sometimes as the queen on the board. Sometimes she has blood on her, as you can see over there. You're not the king, right? The king is often the CEO or the decision makers, but you're kind of there supporting. And that's true in many cases of product-led companies, because you're kind of the point where all of the decisions get made around technology, and especially in a product business. And I'm going to get to, oopsie daisy, I shouldn't push that button. Especially in terms of the type of businesses and the type of teams that you operate in. So this was very useful for me as a thinking paradigm, and I kind of see this now with the various roles I have. I kind of think about companies that use technology in 3 different paradigms. The first one is what we call technology-enabled companies. And what I mean by that is that they love technology, they use it on a day-to-day basis, but it isn't the core business. So if you work in a bank, right, yes, they need technology, and they love it, right? But the business is banking. The business really revolves around interest rates, loans, where you can get into M&A. That's the true nature of the business, right? And there are many, many examples of that, right? If you're in property, the real business is selling and buying houses. But technology, interestingly enough, and I suppose that's why there's so many of us sitting in this room, is really good at enabling many, many businesses today. And you can often argue that it's the differentiator of many businesses today, right? But it's important to recognize, are you in technology-enabled business, or are you another type of business? The second business I think about is a consulting business, where you work for a firm and your major mandate is to sell hours to other businesses, sometimes technology-enabled businesses mostly, where you have specific skills and your business, yes, is a technology business, and you foster an innovation culture, you foster a learnership culture, but ultimately you don't build product of your own, you don't take things to market, you help other companies deliver that. And then the last one, which is kind of where I've spent most of my life, is what we call technology-first companies, where you use technology to build technology products that you sell to your customers. And those products tend to be driven by the technology team. So in Microsoft, the product teams reign supreme because those are the definers, the innovators of what the company actually represents and sell. And the business that I find myself in at the moment at Netstar, we build technology products. Yes, we solve specific solutions with them, but the things we sell, our tracking devices, our fleet services, our data intelligence services, are all technology-led. And I hope that gives you a framework, because often when you're in your career, you need to make a choice, right? That was the big inflection point for me when I went from working to a bank to working for Microsoft. I realized that I'm going to go where the technology is enabler, to technology is the lead product. The other question I get a lot is when you understand the types of businesses, you get different types of leaders in business. The two that kind of often get confused is the CTO and the CIO. And I kind of have a little framework that I try and put together to say sort of what is the difference. And in simplistic terms, I think about the CIO as the person who worries about the internal systems, right? And you often find CIOs in technology-enabled businesses, because a lot of what CIOs end up doing is deciding what technology to buy, where to implement it, what technology we should build to enable that business, but it's all around supporting the business. So it's got a very internal focus, right? Whereas the CTO in many organizations should be worried about the products we build and who we sell them to. What is the addressable market? Where is their technology going? How do I make smarter product-based decisions that I could be selling out there? McKinsey has a pretty interesting model to put some of the other CX, or the executive positions, on a chart. They kind of break it up into internal and external as well, as I said, but you can also maybe have a different dimension on business, product, and technology. And you can kind of see where they put the CTO at the bottom right there versus some of the other CX roles. I think as the sort of digital world is exploding, and as we talk more about data, every other day there's another CX role, so Chief Digital Officer, Chief Design Officer, there's a Chief Data Officer that's kind of popping up. But you can kind of, this gives you a nice framework possibly to think about how the role sort of works in this world. The other interesting role, it's not very common in South Africa, but it's incredibly common overseas, and it's something that I'm instilling in my own product team, is this concept of a VP of engineering, or the head of engineering. And I really, really like this concept. And the reason I like it is that you focus all of the technical discipline around building software and having somebody responsible for the process of building software in a senior executive role. And so in many, many American organizations, they'll have both a CTO and a VP of engineering. They'll have both roles. And the disciplines required in those roles are fundamentally different. The one is worried, if you look at the chart on the left, the one is very worried about the external facing responsibility. What are the products we should be building, as I said? What are the big technology decisions we're making in terms of frameworks? What are our customers saying? Whereas the head of engineering worries a lot more around the delivery of the software once it's actually briefed, the specs that are given, and really worries about the tools and the processes we use to build those products. And it's fascinating to kind of contrast that against the type of organization. So when it says finance there, I think often about technology-enabled businesses, often normally have a role akin to a VP of engineering, because you're really worried about building software. Versus startups is a kind of 50-50 split. As I said, I don't buy that, because in a startup, they're actually equal roles, because they're normally one person that bloody does everything in a startup. And not many startups who have the privilege of having a fleshed out executive team. Versus technology-enabled business, you see how it shifts, right? How CTOs tend to kind of dominate in technology businesses. But the other thing I've learned having various different roles in various different organizations is that it's nice to have a model, but most organizations kind of have their own culture when you land in them. And the expectations of that organization kind of land with you when you land the role in that organization. And you can probably shift it over time, But I guess my first piece of advice here today, I'm going to give you a couple of pieces of advice, is don't try and break the culture of the organization you land in. When I landed in Netstar, there was an expectation of what the CTO should do. I have the CIO reporting into me, so I own all of IT, internal IT, whether I like it or not. I may disagree with that, but that is the culture of the organization, and I embraced it, right? So my first piece of advice is when you move up this chain and you land a role, don't be prissy about what you do and don't do, because the organization will eject you if you get too prissy. The next thing I kind of wanted to share, so what does a CTO's team typically look like? This is kind of my team structure. I have evolved this over the 2 and a bit years that I've been there, but this is kind of a structure that I'm comfortable with and I find works incredibly well for me as a technology leader. I have a product lead, and what my product team does is worry about defining product vision and strategy. The product team is all about what do our customers want? What capability do we have in our organization? Where's the industry going? And they ultimately are responsible for defining the vision of where our products should go, the specifications that they have, the features that they should have. They're not typically highly technical people. They're much more, I kind of think about them as 3-legged animals, right? So excuse the pun. It's a bad joke. The one leg is sitting in the customer space. They listen to what our customers want and ask a bunch of questions from the customers. The other leg, very interestingly enough, if you ask, you get a lot of good feedback from your own employees. Many people forget that. If you just ask your employees what your customers want, if you take the time to ask, they will tell you. And the third leg is kind of where's the industry going? And it doesn't help we think we're building this great, amazing thing and the industry's running 2 steps ahead of us. So we kind of balance those things in the product team. I have a hardware engineering team, so we build and design our own hardware. So I guess my sins of the past working in electronics came back to haunt me. But we build north of 50,000 electronic devices a month that we ship out into the world. And I have a hardware engineering manager. He's my VP of engineering for hardware, right? He worries about all things hardware. He has a team underneath him, and I can leave him alone to run the hardware division. I have a software engineering lead, my VP of software engineering, who runs my software engineering team, and he runs and builds all of our software engineering, delivers, makes decisions around firing, hiring, staffing, and capacity. I then have a quality lead who looks about quality across our organization. So how do we think about the software we put out, the hardware we put out? We are ISO certified, so my quality looks after our ISO processes and how we build and deliver that. Very importantly, I have an architecture lead who sits at my exco, which I think is important because often if you just focus on the engineering side, you always worry about what you're doing today. You don't take a look up and say, well, where am I going tomorrow? So that was an important change I made when I took the organization. We were very focused on narrow delivery. And it was great for narrow delivery, but when you kind of do that for a couple of years, you look back and you go, okay, but we haven't updated our systems for a little while. And function apps are here and low-code environments are here. And we're still writing stuff in C# on IIS servers that is kind of 1990s stuff. So you need to think about how you modernize, and I'm going to get into a little bit of that. And then, like I said, I have a CIO that reports to me. The other massive realization that I learned in my first executive role at Microsoft is that up until that point, my team had been the team that reports to me. We were this unit. And whichever team I had led, I predominantly only worried about my team and the delivery of my team. But when I got into an executive team, and I realized I carried one of those titles on the executive team, I very quickly realized that I have 2 teams. The first team that I have is the one I showed you previously, my team, the team that I run and operate. But the second team I have was the exco team and the table that I sit around, the team that runs the company. And it's very interesting being in an X position where you realize that you're now around a table making decisions about how the company gets run, sometimes tough decisions around cost cutting or strategy, or sometimes things about sometimes downscaling, which we did often at Microsoft when we reorged the company. And that you need to be very careful when you're in that position not to just defend your team. Because if you're only the guy that only ever thinks about his team, you don't ever wear the company hat. And it was quite a humbling experience to sit at the table and try and remain objective about the team you run and balance the decisions you would make when you only worried about your team versus what's in the best interest of the company. And that was a massive, massive learning for me, to say that you have two personas when you take one of these leadership roles. One persona is doing the best you can to run the best team that you can, but also having the balance, having the wisdom to say, well, what's also in the best interests of the company? And that may mean changes in my team that if I was an individual leader only running my team, I probably wouldn't have made if I wasn't sitting at that table. So most executive teams look something like this. I think everybody knows the role of the CEO. He ends up being running the company. That's where the buck stops. He gets hired and fired by the board if things go wrong. The CFO, probably one of my best interfaces, one of my toughest interfaces to deal with. The Chief Financial Officer, super important relationship to carry, because especially when you're in a product business, that's where your funding comes from. And if you can't explain what you're doing to your CFO, he just says no to you all the time. And that conversation doesn't end up really working very well when you two of you lock heads. So you need to learn to speak financial, right? And I'm going to get to some of the qualities of what I do on a day-to-day basis, but that's a super important role. CTO is obvious, the one we're talking about. CIO, we've talked about. Chief Sales Officer, most organizations have some type of sales officer, some type of salesperson sitting on the exco level. He's the one who worries about the numbers, right? He's always telling you your product is late, it doesn't do A, B, and C. You know, your team is shit because they don't deliver this on time and they slipped on this deadline. Everything's easy in their world because they can just go and buy it better than you can deliver it. So those are the type of people you deal with there. Make friends with them. When you make friends with them, your life gets much better. Chief Operations Officer, these are the guys who run the internals of the company, super important roles. Typically, they worry very much about the internal operations of the environment. Normally very metric-driven people. How many calls have we received today? What is our average call closure rate? What does this cost us? How much? So very important role. Chief Marketing Officer, another role that sits normally at the exco table. They're the ones who talk about the company publicly. They speak to the press. They organize your marketing events, et cetera, et cetera. And then a really important one is your head of human resources, or HC, or human capital. Has to be a massive partner of yours and typically sits at the table with you. And then the last one that also is an interesting interface to learn to deal with is legal and corporate affairs, that normally sits at the exco table. This is kind of what a typical exco table looks like in the team that you're going to be plugged into when you take one of these roles, right? I guess the other learning for me is that these people come from very different backgrounds to us, right? When you grow up in a technology environment, you kind of developer, senior developer, principal developer, and then maybe team lead. But we all kind of share this passion for technology, right? Many of these guys around this table, girls around this table, don't share your passion for technology. So you need to learn to speak to this team in a very different way than you would us at this conference today. Okay, so I'm blabbering on about the team, but I guess we're all kind of here to say, well, what the hell do you actually do on a day-to-day basis? So there's a couple of types of CTO, right? I really like this kind of four-box matrix. There's the owner one, top right, who has a high degree of resource and a high degree of control. So those are typically product businesses where you're really responsible a lot for the future of the company. You tend to be given a lot of resources. You own the development team. You have a reasonable budget, and you have a right amount of control. You have trust. The CEO trusts you to make decisions. At the bottom left, you're kind of the influencer, where you don't have any people working for you. You have a low amount of control. I've seen that CTO role in a couple of organizations. That CTO role is almost like the cheerleader, right? You talk about where technology is going. You try and influence your CEO to think about AI and not kind of do things in manual ways, but you have no ability to execute, right? And some organizations like a CTO like that. They like having a technology guy that wheel him out and they kind of does some stuff and then they put him back in the corner and tell him, don't break anything, right? And then you can kind of see the other two quadrants, right? Those are just converses of that, right? So high degree of resource, you get the enabler. Those are the doing guys. Those are the guys that don't really shake the boat very much, but they end up doing a lot, right? They say, don't break the place, make sure you deliver new features, but just carry on doing what you're doing. And then the top right is kind of the challengers. Those are the guys who can't really do very much, but they really, really push the boundary, right, in terms of what the organization should be doing. So this is kind of mostly the classification of CTOs, and I kind of tried to break up what we end up doing on a day-to-day basis in a couple of different sort of headings or subjects. So I thought I'd start with the technology stuff, right, the obvious stuff. So often you set the technology vision and direction, and that direction word is really, really interesting, right? I kind of learned this. I worked for a guy called Mteto Nyati. Some of you might know him. He's now the chairman of Eskom. He taught me very clearly that when I come and speak to him, I better not come with a bunch of ideas, but I better come with a strategy of where I'm going. And he always used the saying, if you don't have an idea where you're going, you can never be lost. And that sits with me to today, right? You better build a strategy and a vision for where you're taking your organization, because it's an incremental delivery of that. And if you can't articulate that, you're just doing a bunch of stuff. Another important kind of quality is translating the company objectives into a technology strategy. So you'll get up and listen to your CEO talk, and he might surprise you sometimes to say, we are going to become an AI-enabled company. And you'll go, oh my God, what did he just say? I have no idea I don't think he knows what he means. And now it becomes your job to take his strategy and turn it into reality. And that happens a lot, right? How do you take the strategy of the company? Hopefully you're influencing the strategy of the company before he makes absurd statements, but sometimes it still happens, and turn that into a reality. And I wrote the word timing behind there because timing is everything with this, right? It's like, how do you turn that into a strategy map that you can deliver over time? Because expectations in this world of today of instant gratification are really important. Sometimes you have to temper the way you can deliver that. And if you paint a strategy, you can show how you get there and not disappoint your key role player around the timing that it will take. A super important thing for me is saying no. I don't know how many people in this room like to say no. One of the things that I see many developers do often, people on my team still today, somebody will come to them and say, can't you just do this thing for me? And we're kind of nice guys and girls, right? We often say, yeah, I'll do that for you. I'll just do it tonight, right? But the problem with that is that the more and more and more of that we do, the more we don't get to do the stuff that we're really trying to do. And so one thing that I really learned, or try to teach my team to do, is say no to the right things, right? I have this saying that saying yes to everything means saying no to everything, or saying no to everything means saying yes to everything, whichever way you want to put it. So that's really important for me. And then the other thing is product versus solution. You also don't have to kind of build everything, right? And I think often as devs, technology people, we like tinkering and we like building stuff, but sometimes you can just go and buy something, and that's also important to recognize. The second part of the role is a kind of the innovation side, and I guess that's the little bit more of the nefarious side, it's the more of the side that's interestingly to define, but is how do you design and build new stuff? I talked about it a little bit in terms of what we do with product management, but there's lots of other ways to do it, right? I think there's design think as a concept, there's R&D as a concept. But in many cases, especially in product businesses, you're the custodian of how do you take innovation and turn it into reality. In many cases, the CIO or the CEO will look at you and go, okay, you're the clever guys, right? What should we be doing? And that puts a hell of a lot of pressure on you to design and build products that you need to take to industry. I'm personally a massive fan of what I believe to be customer-led innovation. If you just listen, you will hear where things are going. But you must listen very carefully. I think I might have it on another slide, so I might just repeat myself. But I love the Henry Ford quote, right? When he asked people what they wanted, everybody told him, does anybody know? A faster horse, right? But if you pause that answer carefully, you realize what they wanted to do was move from A to B faster. So maybe a faster horse was not the answer, but he realized that the solution was getting people from A to B. And that, to me, is the essence of product innovation by listening to your customers. Don't listen to how, but listen to what. The other big part of this is, I wrote that word legacy there. I think everybody who writes codes deals with this on a daily basis. We can call it legacy, we can call it what we want. It's how do you move an organization forward, right? And how do you take what made you great at this point, look at it and objectively move you to the next point? It's a massive part of the role, especially if you join an organization that is not a startup, right? Startups tend to not have legacy when they start, but they amass it very quickly. So legacy ends up being a big noose around your neck and something you need to learn how to deal with. And then the last point, last 2 points on this are, the pivoting point is often when you do something completely unique, right? How do you take something and go, well, we used to do this and we do that, right? How do you, a really interesting one for me in the Microsoft world was, how do we move from building software that ran only on Windows machines to supporting an environment that ran on Linux and actually, interestingly, on phones? And we realized, I certainly realized when I lived that change at the company, we went from an addressable market that had a couple of hundreds of millions of devices being PCs in the world at that point in time. And when you say, I'm going to release software that runs on other operating systems, whether they're phones or other OSs, you went and you put a zero, I think 2 zeros at the time behind the addressable market. It was a fundamental change for the company. It wasn't too far from what they'd done, but it was a radical idea at the time. And we can kind of see what the Microsoft stock price has done over the last couple of years with those kind of pivots. Okay, now I'm going to get into sort of the other teams that you deal with. So the other teams that you deal often with is customer and sales. You need to spend time with customers. If you don't like spending time with customers, don't take this role, right? You need to be comfortable in front of customers. You need to be able to talk to them. You need to be able to ask them questions, and you need to tell your customers where you're going as an organization and what they can expect out of you. I try to see a customer at least once a week. It doesn't always work out like that, but I find it invaluable in running the team by listening to what our customers want. And it's amazing in organizations still to this day, how many executives don't actually go and speak to their customers, right? Especially organizations that have been around for a while. They tend to lock themselves in the ivory towers. They think they know what their customers want, and then they put products and services out there, and they can't understand why nobody wants it. If you just go and speak to your customers, you'll find out. So that chief sales officer guy that I talked about that kind of pushes you all the time, make friends with him, because he'll take you to see your customers. And I guess there's another skill that I learned at Microsoft is that if you're good at speaking to customers, you're also pretty good at sales. So you might not call yourself a salesperson, but when you're good at representing the company, you can do it in a genuine way, and you actually help the company succeed. So the executive team, I kind of talked about this a little bit. I think in many cases, your role in working with the executive team is translating your technology strategy into a journey. I talked a little bit about the interface to the CFO, so making sure that you're able to articulate your strategy into investment asks and you get the budget for it. That's your job, right? To make sure that your team has the investment to do what they want. If you want GitHub Copilot for your team because it increases their productivity, your CFO is going to ask you, why am I paying these extra licensing costs? You need to explain that in a way that either increases their productivity, helps efficiency, builds better products. You need to speak financial, right? It's really useful if you have some P&L understanding. You need to understand how a budget works. When a guy puts a spreadsheet in front of you with a whole bunch of numbers, if you've never done that in your life before, it's going to be tricky for you, right? So if you aspire to this role, I seriously suggest I'm not asking you to become an accountant, but you should be able to read a P&L and understand how it's driven. Because your CFO is going to hold you. He's going to give you one of those when you take this role and say, you own this budget. And when you miss it by 200%, he's probably going to fire you. So you need to know how to run a budget, manage a budget, hold people accountable to delivering on that budget. If you don't like that, this role is probably not for you. Media and PR is a hugely important part of the role. I think it's a skill you need to learn. If you don't like public speaking, it's probably something you should think about. Rob's always looking for good presenters. But having the ability to represent your company on a PR or media stage is really important in this role. You're often the guy who's kind of wheeled up and said, okay, talk about the products we're building, the technology strategy that we have, or talk about where we're going. And dealing with media is kind of interesting, right? Because it kind of looks all nice when you're in front of them, but if you've never been media trained or had some experience in the media, their job in life is to trap you. It's to ask you funny questions where you say the wrong thing and they can quote the CTO of Netstar saying that he's going to reduce load shedding, right? So it's an important skill to learn, both formally in terms of what you do and don't say in a proper media environment, but also how to say it. So it was certainly a very interesting skill that I had to learn along my journey. I was very fortunate that I kind of got thrust into it in my Microsoft career and went through various facets of media training. And it's kind of something that I have in the back of my head and now holds me in great stead in kind of these roles that I had. So again, if there's something to aspire to, think about how you're going to get that experience. How can you stick your hand up to get that? The board and investors are kind of another interesting kettle of fish, right? So especially in publicly traded entities. Kind of took me a while to realize this in my own journey, but everybody thinks the CEO is the big boss. Actually, the CEO is not the big boss. The big boss is the board. It's the people who own, and normally the shareholders in a publicly listed entity and the chairman of the board who runs a publicly listed board, right? They're the guys who appoint the CEO. They're the guy who fires the CEO if he doesn't do a good job. And ultimately, often you get kind of wheeled up in front of that board and get to talk about what you're building. And I kind of put that in the same bucket as I do my discussion with media and PR. You need to be incredibly weighted on what you say at that table, how you say it, and the commitments you make. Because you don't get to make fluffy commitments in there, because next, in a year's time, when you get in front of that board, they're going to ask you, so Mr. DeWitt, when you were here last year, you said you were going to do A, B, and C, and trust me, they write it down. How have you delivered on those? And it doesn't end up very nicely for you when you and R and talk about how you've changed strategy halfway through the year. So it's a very important audience to recognize and a very discerning audience to learn how to deal with. Right, so the last bit I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about is leadership and culture, because I believe this is a super, super important part of the role, often an underlooked part of the role, and certainly something that I had to learn to embrace when I took one of these roles. A lot of what you do is around people and change management as a leader, whether it's any one of those CX roles that I've put on the table, but especially in this kind of role, in a CTO role. Because ultimately, I don't write code every day anymore. What I do is work with my team to talk about the strategy we're driving, how they're going to deliver on it. And so a lot of what I do in my day-to-day work is enabling my people to do great jobs. I have this kind of leadership mantra, I wrote it there, I call it responsible delegation, right? I believe if I entrust the people who work for me, and I trust that they're going to do a good job, and empower them to do the right job, that they will personally deliver on that. And so a lot of technology leadership is about how you deal with people and how you get the best out of people. And I kind of have some advice at the end, but if that's not for you, if you don't get any energy, if you don't get any gratitude out of dealing with people, empowering people, and getting people to do great things, then you really need to think about whether this role is for you. Because a lot of your own satisfaction is not going to be about what you do. It's going to be about what your team does or your people do. And that's a different kind of satisfaction that you need to make peace with. So I have a couple of things, big things that I think are important in the people and change management. The first thing is this concept of change. And I kind of pivoted in two areas. I really like the Gartner model in terms of change, right? And this is product change. This is how people think about technology adoption. They have this thing called the hype cycle. If you haven't seen it, go and take a look at it. They have hype cycles for different types of technologies. I think this is the hype cycle for, new technology, they call it. But the cycle is always the same, right? So you have this innovation idea, everything is great. The expectations go through the roof, right? We think AI is going to save the world, right? It's going to do everything except sliced bread, right? So you have this peak of expectations. And then you kind of, I love that word, you have this trough of disillusionment, where you realize that my great idea, everybody thinks it's going to do everything for me, can only do this much, right? And everybody gets kind of disillusioned with, oh, we thought it's going to solve world hunger, and now it can only slice a piece of bread. But then you kind of start sloping up, right? You get the slope of enlightenment and this platform of productivity. And you can kind of trace this trajectory. Maybe the curve flattens a bit and lengthens out a bit, but this is kind of how products go through their life cycle. And the trajectory of how it goes through that is different to different products. Some of them move through that incredibly quickly. We kind of have great expectations for them. They fail and we kick them out the door. Or some of them take a little while to mature and get to that. But it's a useful framework to think about how you think about change of the product. The other important change is the human change, arguably more important. This is a model that was developed in the late 60s around how humans themselves go through change, right? And in many cases, the first time it's shock and denial. Oh my God, you want me to do what? I am not going to code in C++ anymore. You want me to use Rust? Are you crazy, right? And then you get the anger blame thing. Oh, my manager doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a freaking idiot, right? And then they try and bargain. Okay, maybe I'll try, but I'm not sure it's going to work, right? And then they come to work and you ask them, how's your day? It's terrible. You're doing okay? No, I'm terrible. What's the matter? I hate Rust. But you have to persist, right? If you really believe that that's the right strategy and you know there's a good outcome, now it's the hard part, right? This is the hard yards. This is where you don't give up. And you push. And then you kind of get exploration. And then that one day you walk into his office and you go, how's it going? He's like, this Rust stuff's actually not so bad, eh? I saw it, I don't get so many memory bugs anymore. It's kind of interesting. Eh? And then you kind of get this decision process. It's like, actually, I can do this. Eh? And then you get integration, where it just becomes, how's it going? No, it's fine. It's I love this stuff. So it's really important to recognize this, right? And if you don't like taking a team through a journey like this is a super important part of the role, right? How do you get your team? You're not just the smart guy who sits in the corner that comes up with the ideas. Your responsibility as a CT is to take your team through this journey and recognize that it's hard and that you need to push through it, because you'll get the outcomes at the end that you really believe in if you follow this process. The other ways I think about this, I really love this model, is how you should approach people in this situation there. So this is a concept called situation leadership, or it first starts with awareness. My story is always, how do you ride a bicycle, right? And it starts with what they call unconscious incompetence. So when you first start, it's like, hey, this is easy. I'm sure I can do this, right? Until you try it for the very first time. And you get on a bike and you fall over on your head and you realize, geez, like those make it look so easy, but actually it's not so easy. So you're kind of consciously incompetent then. And then the next part is like you're consciously competent. So what you do is you try and ride a bike, and now you can, but like someone tries to talk to you while you're riding, you say, shh, I can't listen, talk to you now, I'm riding my bike, right? And then the last bit is you're unconsciously competent. And you can ride along, you can lift your water bottle out, take your hands off the steering wheel. And this is a super interesting framework to think about how you work with people. Because when you're in that unconsciously incompetent quadrant, this is my framework for how I help people through change. You need to delegate. You don't ask the guy, hey, how do you think we should do this rusting? You need to tell him we're doing it, right? And as you get more competent, you guys will get the slides after this. I'm not going to talk through the whole model. You change your management style all the way up to when somebody's super competent at something, you don't need to tell them what to do. You just check on them every now and again and say, how's it going? It's like, oh, I'm fine, I've got this. And if you don't adopt your management style to this, if you try and tell somebody who's really good at what they're doing, if you delegate to them and tell them what they should be doing on a day-to-day basis, what are they going to do? They're going to hate you, right? Because you're the guy who's trying to tell me what to do when I know better than you. So you better make sure you understand your style of leadership and how you interact with people depending on the competence that those people carry. So I'm going to close out with 3 kind of pointer slides. Maybe some recommendations on the decisions you must make if you aspire to go up the street. First, big decision. Do you want to remain an individual contributor or do you want to become a manager? And be super clear with what you give up when you make that decision. The way I think often you should make the decision is what gives you your sense of energy, what gives you your sense of mastery. If you only get mastery or energy out of solving the hardest technical problems behind your machine every day, management's probably not for you. But if you like speaking to people and getting a team to move, and speaking to external people and explaining to them where you're going, then maybe this management CT track is important and maybe you should consider that. If you make that decision, your new reality looks something like this. You will no longer code on a day-to-day basis, and you need to be able to make sure that you're okay with that. I will never forget when I was in my final interview to join Microsoft in 2000. I sat down with then was the GM of the company. He said to me, you need to understand that you're no longer going to be writing code, and that your sense of purpose and worth is not about how good technically you are. Are you okay with that? It was one of the best interviews I ever had. And I said to him, I'll get back to you. Because I really had to think about it, right? Up until then, my entire purpose was, I was a great C++ developer. I wrote internet banking. And this guy's just telling me, throw that all away. What defines you is not that anymore. It's a super, super defining moment in my life. Breadth versus depth, right? Make sure that you're comfortable going across lots of different disciplines. On my average day, I have a licensing conversation, I have a technology conversation about electronic components we're buying. I talk about which frameworks you're using in software, et cetera, right? So make sure that you're okay to change discussions, change depth of what you talk about, and talk about many different subjects. Staying technically relevant, that's the imposter syndrome. I run the team, I better know what I'm talking about. It's tough, right? Because you need to at least be competent in what you do, but you also need to make peace with the fact that you delegate down and you trust your team is going to do the right thing. And then be the interface between product and business. The last point I have is that if this is for you, the first point I'll make is put up your hand. Nobody's going to give it to you. Stick up your hand and ask for it. If this is what you want, make sure your organizations know that you want to do this. Apply for different roles, stick up your hand, get experience. Because it doesn't often get given to you. You need to put up your hand and ask for it. A little bit of experience and diversity helps. So if you only ever worked in one organization, I'm not appealing you to all resign tomorrow, but working in different size organizations certainly helps. Working in different environments, do a stint in consulting, do a stint in a product company. It really helps build your skills in this space and gives you the diversity to do, I think, be a better leader in this world. And then the last point I have is that if you don't have a mentor, if you don't have somebody that you can tap into to ask those tough questions when you're really late at night and you're scratching your head and you're thinking you should resign, shouldn't die, and your wife is really tired of you asking her the same question because she has no advice for you, do you have somebody you can call? There are lots of people who are able to help people in this world, and you just need to ask. Cool, that's me. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it gave you a bit of advice. I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A, but I hope that was good. Thanks, guys.
Very little time, so I'd like to see your customers. Do you use that responsible delegation to allow your team to speak to the customer, or would you prefer to do it yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question. So that responsible delegation thing on customer, so that's actually why I have a product team. So a lot of what I ask my product team to do, the product managers, is to go and see those customers. And then often we try and kind of roll that up into a, so that they can summarize what they're sharing across multiple customers. And then we can kind of see, okay, we're seeing this pattern often. So is that important? Often I end up, I mean, it's a great point because time does become a super important balance. Often what I end up doing is kind of often going with the CEO to his kind of meetings where there's a technology slot. So we'll go and see other CEOs of other big companies. We go and see the insurance companies. We go and see the banks, et cetera, et cetera. Not that's the only customer meetings that I do, but you think you get one perspective out of that. You must be careful with that because they also sit in their ivory towers and assume that they know what their customers want, so you must be super careful of that. But absolutely, delegation is super important. I think the trick is, how do you take that delegation, bubble it up, and get a consensus view? Because I think multiple heads on the same problem are much better than just one. So it's definitely not just a solo job by any means. Yeah.
How do you balance changing too often and still managing those expectations?
Yeah.
Either your team, C-suite team, versus just sticking with the current strategy.
Got it. So for those that can't hear, the question is just like, how do you balance pivoting or doing radical changes versus doing the status quo, just carrying on, kind of shining the apple? It's a tough thing, honestly, right? And I think it's especially for companies who have success at a certain point, right? So what got you here may not always get you forward, right? I always use the analogy of kind of changing the airplane, changing the engine while flying the plane, right? You know, that's kind of what it feels like. So you can't crash the plane, right? That's rule number one. The CEO will fire you and the CFO will fire you the day you tank the revenue of the company. But you need to balance that with how do you move the company forward? So I kind of like this incremental innovation, and I like try and move the company forward one bit at a time. And normally what we do is we introduce a new concept, kind of show it around, get some buy-in, and then we make that the new product. There's other ways of doing it, and I'm going to get killed for time here, but sometimes that happens on the product side. I think what you also need to be super careful of, one thing I've learned, is worry about the infrastructure. So I kind of have this framework of sort of what is product and what is infra. And I mean, when I don't mean infra like servers, I mean what runs the company, right? What are the big decisions you're making to modernize the back end of the organization? Often that gets forgotten, right? So platform services, can I roll some type of industry standard in and kill all of those services that I've been custom maintaining for a while? Those are important, but normally you make those decisions. You don't have to get too much buy-in for that. Cool. I'm going to hang around here. I think the next presenter wants to get on the stage. So come and speak to me here, and then we can kind of have more conversation. Thanks very much, everybody.